Washington Journal continues.
Michael Hirsh is chief correspondent at National Journal. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Libby.
I wanted to talk about your book, published this year, Capital Offense, How Washington's Wise Men Turned America's Future Over to Wall Street. And you write that this book is about how an idea that what's good for big finance is good for America came to define this era and then spiraled completely out of control.
Right. Well, my basic idea is that you can't explain the magnitude of what happened with the financial crisis and the economic hangover that continues that we're dealing with in the headlines every day just by writing books about Wall Street and what a bunch of crazy traders did. Something this huge and systemic, something that infected the entire financial system and then the economy happens over a much longer period of time. And that's what I try to explain. It's a narrative going back to the Reagan era of how an idea that free markets always work, that markets are always good, government's always bad, including government supervision, went completely overboard. And particularly with regard to financial markets, which economists have always known behave differently. That was all sort of thrown overboard during this era. And of course, we saw this period in which Wall Street created ever more complex products. What people didn't fully understand with the crisis was that these, crazy CDOs, these very complex products built out of subprime mortgages, didn't come out of nowhere. There was a long period of gestation over more than a decade in which Wall Street firms were developing ever more complex products, taking assets and repackaging them and selling them. And this was really just the culmination of that process. So I try to explain that whole thing and that whole narrative in my book.
And you say that Wall Street became the master of Main Street rather than its handmaiden.
Yeah, I mean, that's one aspect of the economy that really hasn't been addressed or fixed at all, I think, after 2 years of debate and discussion in this giant financial reform bill, which is that Wall Street continues to dominate the time horizons of corporations, the way CEOs think, not in the financial economy, but the real economy. And I think you can trace back a lot of our problems, the hollowing out, destruction of the middle class, to the way in which Wall Street and its very short time horizons and the compulsion to speculate, led to a lack of concern about any other aspect of the economy. And we got to the point over this 3-decade or so period where, the health of the economy, even today, is where's the Dow? And that's not really true. I mean, the health of the economy has a lot more to do with social equity and other concerns that were simply thrown overboard during this period.
What do we take for granted when we talk about financial regulation? Because in your book, you chart out the change over time, sometimes gradual change that's happened in the way we think about the money markets and regulation. We just take it for granted now, sort of how the overriding philosophy is.
Well, that's one of the things I try to explain, how regulation and oversight not only was outpaced by where the markets were going, but it became kind of a fool's occupation. It became a lost art. One of it's very character-driven. I tell the story of all these individuals, and one of them is a guy named Jerry Corrigan, who was the president of the New York Fed back in the early 90s. He was really the first person back in 1991, 92, to warn about all of these off-the-books derivatives and what were banks doing and did they know what they were doing. And Jerry Corrigan was known as a plumber in the financial industry. He was a guy who knew how the inner workings of the industry were conducted. He knew about backroom payments and when banks could get in trouble and not. And what's interesting is how his way of thinking about markets was lost, because we got vested in this idea that, markets are always going to correct themselves. This was the Alan Greenspan concept. In the end, you could depend on the markets and the firms atop them to correct themselves and know what they were doing. And of course, we found out that they didn't. But that sort of regulatory art of Jerry Corrigan and people like him was lost. And so you got this, we got into this period when regulation was simply ridiculed. There was no regulation at all. And we only found that out at the very end during the nadir of this crisis, when all of a sudden everyone from Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson at the time and the Bush administration and Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed, realized that the financial system had become something they no longer comprehended. And the extent of this sort of shadow banking crisis, where all of these products that were off the books, that were not being monitored, were sinking the system. But that realization came far too late to do anything about it.
Michael Hirsh writes in his book, Capital Offense, also lost was any sense of how much finance, when completely unleashed, had come to dominate the economy rather than serve in its traditional role as a supplier of capital to the real economy of goods and services. So we're talking about sort of the ethereal nature of the stock market versus sort of concrete items and goods.
Right. Well, also how at some indefinable point things passed over from sort of rollicking markets, venture capital markets, which are good, which for most of this country's history and Wall Street's history, even though they occasionally go overboard, have been healthy, certainly healthier than a lot of the overregulated markets elsewhere around the world in supplying capital to new ideas and new companies. I mean, that was, Silicon Valley, a lot of the companies in the biotech boom benefited from this. But at some point in the 1990s and 2000s, that impulse passed over into what became simply the desire to speculate and pure gambling. And we saw that with a lot of these over-the-counter derivatives, which really are simply side bets on what's going to happen to interest rates, what's going to happen to various economies. And it became a giant casino, indeed something even worse than a casino, because unlike in a casino where you know generally what the house odds are on the craps game or the roulette game, here, no one even knew what the odds were any longer. So it was just completely out of control.
The book, Capital Offense, How Washington's Wise Men Turned America's Future Over to Wall Street. We're talking with author Michael Hirsh. He's also chief correspondent at the National Journal Group. He's also served as senior editor and national economics correspondent for Newsweek, was based here in its Washington bureau. You've probably seen him on the show before. The numbers to call if you want to join the conversation: Republicans 202-737-0001, Democrats 202-737-0002, Independent callers 202-628-0205. And in your book, you, as we've mentioned, you go back in time 30 years and look at the various administrations and give a reflection on how things led to the financial crisis we just experienced.
Yeah, again, it's important to do that and to understand how, I don't demonize either side of the aisle, since this is a show in which we hear from Republicans and Democrats on separate lines. I spend just as much time criticizing the Clinton administration as I do the George W. Bush administration. What you had was officialdom that came to buy into an idea that economists knew was false, that financial markets can be left untouched. And one of the most fascinating figures to me in my narrative is Larry Summers, who just announced recently, that he's leaving as Obama's chief economic advisor, because Larry Summers is truly one of the great economists of his generation, and the winner of a very prestigious prize awarded every 2 years to economists under 40. He knew some of his own work in the 1980s had shown the fallacy of the idea of rational markets in finance. And yet, when he became a policymaker, first in the Clinton administration, under Robert Rubin, the Treasury Secretary, and then later under Obama, he became influenced by this idea that you could leave financial markets alone. In fact, there was one famous moment in 2005, at sort of the height of the bubble, just before things went bad, at the retreat in Jackson Hole that the central bankers hold every year, when a very smart and prescient economist named Raghu Rajan of the University of Chicago presented a paper saying, I think we might be in trouble here. The banks are getting loaded with all this risk, and they don't seem to know how to handle it. And Summers got up and sort of ridiculed Rajan, basically called him a semi-Luddite, and could not have been more wrong. Oddly enough, this was the man that President Obama chose not only as his chief economic advisor, but as the guy who was going to try to fix the very same system that Summers had been vested in helping to create.
Let's get to the phones. Richard joins us from Villanova, Pennsylvania, on our Democrats line. Hi there.
Good morning. Mr. Hirsh.
Morning.
I'm not a trained economist, but I've always been of the opinion, starting back in the middle 80s, that the deregulation of the savings and loans was probably the seminal event that led to this eventual meltdown of the entire system. What would be your opinion?
No, you're absolutely right. I know if it's a central event, it is a key event. It is the first indication, first of all, what can happen when a subsection of the banking industry is left unregulated. Just as importantly, it led to the securitization phenomenon, the securitizing of bad assets, which was initially orchestrated by the government, by the Resolution Trust Corporation, to deal with the problem of all these bankrupt S&Ls. And so that's a key moment in history over the last couple of decades. But there are a lot of key moments that leads to a market that's out of control. And another one of the key figures in my narrative who plays more of a heroic role is Joseph Stiglitz, the economist who won the Nobel Prize, who had been a longtime skeptic of markets, who wrote a paper back in 1990 basically questioning, the securitization phenomenon that is now very new. Where is that going to lead? Is that going to lead lenders to be less responsible about the quality of the loans they're issuing? And, of course, that was a question that we saw answered in the most devastating way 18 years later when we realized that, in fact, there were no standards any longer in terms of issuing loans. There was no longer any relationship between lender and borrower to ensure that loans were good or responsibly made. Because of the securitization phenomenon that had basically separated the two, sort of like a divorced couple on two sides of the world that are connected only by this most tenuous connection of say an alimony payment or something, or an interest payment in the case of these loans. And so that, getting back to the caller's point, yes, that is a very, very key moment in the history of this phenomenon.
We're in Michigan, where Mike is joining us on the independent line. Hi there.
Good morning. Mr. Hirsh, I take great umbrage at, I got several comments I want to make, but I take great umbrage at any criticism of the Clintons, especially when they were surrounded by the enemy for 6 years. Now, my comment is this. Now, supposedly the electorate is all upset about the Wall Street bailout, and they're going to vote Republican and all this garbage I keep hearing. But yet, they're going to vote for the same people who are nothing but shills for Wall Street. And that's what Republicans are. They're just shills for big business. But supposedly these grassroots organizations and the Tea Party are all upset, and they're going to vote Republican.
Mike, to bring you back to the topic of this book, what do you think the Obama administration should do at this point to help with the economy, to help with what's happening on Wall Street?
Well, if you look back to the Clinton administration once again, from 92 to 94, a lot of Democrats lost their seats in the House, passing the Clinton stimulus bills, so to speak. It wasn't until 96 that the economy started picking up. What do people expect, that the Obama administration could just wave a wand and wipe out 6 to 8 years of bad malfeasance of the Republican Party?
I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the caller makes some good points. Again, I'm not demonizing anyone. I think the Clinton officials, Robert Rubin on down, thought they were doing the right thing. Certainly I've interviewed all of these key figures for the book, would maintain that they wouldn't have let things get as out of hand as they did during the 2000s, during the George W. Bush administration. Maybe that's so. It's impossible to say. But it's just another important data point along the way. And I think, his final point, which is how do people expect in this current election environment that you're going to get back to where you were, say, in the high-growth 90s, and it's a very reasonable point. Obama and Joe Biden, the vice president, are out there right now on the stump saying, look, we have created a lot of additional jobs. We have turn the economy around, even though it's very slow growth and it feels like a recession. We've now had 4 quarters of growth out of the recession, and this takes time. And I would agree with that. I think that, again, something this deep and systemic, a crisis in which the whole system was infected over a period of 3 decades, you simply don't come out of that in 18 months of this administration. Unfortunately, it seems like that message is not being carried well with the electorate, and you can have a lot of anger out there, and the real possibility the Republicans take over one or both of the houses of Congress.
As you've talked to these leading economists, people who were influential in forging the direction of American economic policy, and you've also talked to politicians for this book, do they feel like divided government led to compromises that didn't work? For example, the stimulus package that was passed by Congress under President Obama's watch, some said we need much more, but this is as much as we can get in order to get a couple of Republicans on board. Is there a reflection that compromise has actually bred problems, or have the administrations been able to really do what they wanted and get people on board?
No, I think there's a sense now that the Obama administration made too many compromises with a Republican Party and a conservative movement, which, as we've seen, has been taken over by more and more right-leaning elements, the Tea Party movement, that they made too many compromises with a Republican Party that, frankly, has not addressed its role in any of this. I mean, we continue to hear the fantasy from the right that these were government programs that led to the crisis. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were encouraging all of these bad mortgages, and that was the real source of the problem. They were an element in the crisis, but just that, no more than that. And you don't hear the Republicans dealing with the very real implications of effectively 30 years of Reagan, runaway Reaganism, which I think began as a healthy reaction in the 1980s to too much government, but like most revolutions, overreached itself. And that was the problem here. So you just don't hear a real discussion in Washington about rethinking the proper balance between markets and government, acknowledging that we're capitalists, we want market growth, but you got to have the right degree of government as well. Instead, we have all of this sort of ranting across the divide. And one of the criticisms of Obama is that he didn't realize that soon enough, and sort of handed away too many things to the Republicans, to centrist Democrats who are sort of captured by big business or the Wall Street lobby, without taking a sort of more FDR, Franklin Roosevelt type role in inveighing against the bankers and fixing what needed to be fixed.
Our guest, Michael Hirsh, is the author of Capital to Wall Street. He's chief correspondent for National Journal. Let's go to Bill, Republican caller in Baltimore. Good morning.
Good morning. I had a comment about the capital requirements that the banks were required to keep. And I believe that fundamentally that is the root of the problem. I don't think there's any problem with derivatives or securitization of assets or any of the other activities that the banks were engaged in. But what really got the whole system on the wrong path was when the capital requirements for the banks were loosened. And that allowed the banks to become extremely leveraged. And that is really fundamentally the problem. And I lay that at the foot of the Congress, which allowed those capital requirements to be reduced.
Yeah. Again, another very important part of the story, but there is this tendency in discussing the crisis to be a little bit like, the blind man and the elephant, and you're feeling one part of it and you're saying, oh, this must be something, or you're feeling another part of it and you're saying this must be something else, and not sort of getting your hands around the whole. The caller is right. I mean, that was a moment when banks were allowed to risk more and more of their capital and get over-leveraged and keep less and less of their own capital staked in these securities. That led to a lot of recklessness. One of the more interesting conversations, characters in my book, is Paul O'Neill, who, a few people remember these days, was Bush's Treasury Secretary, was kind of laughed out of town at the time because at the time in the early 2000s, he wasn't Robert Rubin. He was sort of ill at ease in front of the cameras. But I went back to talk to him, and a lot of his ideas actually sound pretty good now. He was extremely skeptical of Wall Street. One of the things he says is, you know what? This 2,000-page financial reform bill that they just passed, we could have done it in 2 pages. And one of the pages would say that banks had to stake 20%, not the 7% that's now being discussed internationally, which is a substantial increase, but not enough, according to O'Neill and others, but 20% of their capital on every loan they make. That would automatically make them responsible because so much of their own money was at stake. And at the same time, on page 2, O'Neill would say that would-be mortgage holders would need to put down 20% of their capital if they wanted to buy a home. That O'Neill says, would simply fix the problem. And actually, there's a great deal to what he says. It's very, it's practical sense. So yes, the reduction in capital standards, as everyone recognizes, was a key problem. I think one of the questions out there now is how much of a raising of those standards is necessary to prevent this from happening again.
Daryl asks on Twitter, would you agree that the repeal of Glass-Steagall sealed our fate for the current crisis?
I would. Again, another important element, not by itself responsible, but what the repeal of Glass-Steagall did was eliminate all the firewalls that had existed in the financial system. Remember, Glass-Steagall was imposed in the 1930s when it became clear that traditional banks, which as part of this legislation during the New Deal were being federally insured by the government, began to behave recklessly like investment banks. And there's two different cultures there. Traditional banking is very cautious, and investment banking and trading on Wall Street, very bold, risk-taking. And the point is, you don't want those cultures to mix. It's what people don't understand when they talk about all these arcane topics. It's really a question of human nature. And what happened when Glass-Steagall was repealed in 1999, which some people at the time called the Citigroup Authorization Act, because it basically enabled Citigroup to become this giant financial conglomerate, was that what had been traditional islands of safety in the system, which were commercial banks, which in past crises would go in and sort of rescue the situation, they too became infected with all of this risk-taking behavior and all these bad securities on their books. And so you no longer had firewalls of any kind to prevent the conflagration from spreading. And that's one reason why the whole system, was in danger of going down.